Okay, so I'm Kim Woodbury. I'm the director of the Miami Valley Small Business Development Center here in Dayton. We're going to talk today about the Ohio Childcare Reopening Guidelines. Since I am a user of childcare but not a provider, I have brought in some big guns, some people who are actually providers and in the system to help me today. So I'm going to ask Lisa if you'd introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Lisa Babb, and I am the Strategic Director in the Miami Valley region. So we work alongside 10 counties, and we support families in finding childcare, and we support the programs in increasing the quality of their childcare programs and working with them with professional development and with the food program. And we also have Caitlin from our agency. And Caitlin, you want to share your place with 4C?
Hi, everybody. I see
Hi.
some faces here that are not faces, but names that I recognize. So I'm Caitlin Hackett, and I am one of the team leads with the 4C for Children out of the Miami Valley office. My background is infant, toddler, and family child care, as well as working as a coach and now a team lead for professional development.
Thank you.
So she's kind of the bomb diggity and has experience in everything, which is why she's on with me on this call. And you guys that have had her know that she's amazing.
Great. And we also have Karen Lampe with Inspire for Children, or Inspire Children, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Karen Lampe, and I am the owner and operator of CWCC Inc. We actually have 3 different brands of programs here in the Miami Valley. Inspire Center for Learning is one of them. And then we also have Creative World of Learning and Creative World of Montessori, which is a private Montessori school that goes pre-K through 8th grade. In our early learning programs, we have Head Start, Early Head Start, ECE, Preschool Promise, as well as publicly funded childcare and private pay children. So we blend a lot of different funding streams together. I also sit on the board of the Ohio Association of Childcare Providers and serve as the advocacy chair, and sit on the governor's Early Childhood Advisory Council.
Okay, thank you. So today I am going to go over the guidelines, and then Karen and Caitlin and Lisa are going to refine the answer questions and give you some more insight into there. I do think that most of you have probably seen the guidelines. Sometimes though it helps to hear them as opposed to just reading them. So I wanted to make sure that you're hearing that as well. So Ohio child care facilities are going to be able to be open on May 31st. As part of the Responsible Restart Ohio program. But you should continue to follow the Ohio Administrative Code. So you, some of the guidelines in the Restart Ohio program are things that you're already doing. They have hand washing guidelines. It's already in the Ohio Administrative Code and things like that. So a lot of these things you're already going to know about, but then there's some twists on that. There's also a lot of great guidance and best practice webinars at the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. So you can follow that link and go there. There was, they have webinars, and in fact, I have a slide that tells what they have. So, okay, so COVID-19 is still with us. Despite the fact that we're open and we're moving forward, it is still something we have to be careful about. And we all know that childcare is vital to restarting the economy of Ohio. Without childcare, people will not be able to operate and work. So the guidelines are meant to create conditions that will allow providers to keep the children safe, to keep caregivers and staff safe, and to keep the families safe. And the guidelines that were put out have 2 parts. You'll see mandatory and recommended best practices. So the way I've organized the deck is that I have anything that's mandatory, I've indicated it's mandatory, and then the recommended best practices follow that as well. I also have put in some of the best practices from Job and Family Services, some of the guidelines and recorded trainings. You all see they have posters there too, and there's the link again. I think I might be able to go out to it. Nope, I didn't. It's not a hot link. So, but that's a great resource as well. So the guideline areas cover just general and more staff issues at drop-off, during the day, at pickup, physical environment, and confirmed cases, what to do in all these situations. The first thing is that the ratios, I'm sure you all know, have been reduced. I have included them on the slide. Infants and toddlers, the infants are staff to child is 1 to 4 with the maximum of 6 children per room, and the toddlers is 1 to 6 with a maximum of 6 children per room, while the preschool and school age are both 1 to 9 with a maximum of 9 children per room. Each child should still have 35 square feet of space as well.
Kim, can I jump in on this
Yes.
slide?
Mm-hmm.
So yesterday they actually released the transitional ratio and group size from the state. So I know there's been some questions for my type B and type A providers around ratio and group. So I'm just going to read what they said. And if you need a copy of it, please just put your information. You can private chat with me in here too if you don't want to post it for everyone to see, but your contact information, I can send it on to you as well.
And if you send that to me, I can make sure everyone gets a copy.
Awesome. So for my type Bs, it's 1 teacher to 6, which is our same ratio. No more than 3 children under the age of 2, which we all know. And then for type As, this was the one that was mostly in question. At least 1 teacher to 6 children, no more than 3 children under the age of 2. If there's more than 1 group of 6 children, each group must be in its own room, including during naps and meals. So for those of you who have a ratio up to 12 with your additional staff with your type A, making sure that you have 2 spaces available for your 2 different groups of 6.
Is that 35 square feet still applicable to that?
Yes.
Caitlin? Yes, okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. Also mandatory is that employees must perform a daily symptom assessment. It's actually for themselves and for children as well. But those symptoms include cough, fever, chills, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, muscle pain, sore throat, and new loss of taste or smell. It's kind of funny because I've been going over a lot of these guidelines for different types of businesses, and there's some different ones for different types of business. Like restaurants, they include a shaking with chills on there. So, and this is something you've been doing all along with your business, with your childcare businesses, requiring everyone to stay home if they're sick or if they're symptomatic. Okay. We've had a discussion about keeping track of those assessments. We do think this is going to be important for you to prove that you're doing the assessments, and that can be tricky because there's HIPAA regulations and things like that. So I have did this with the restaurants, but put together a symptom checklist that people fill out themselves so that you're not being so invasive. But this is, however you choose to do it is fine. It might be just a log saying, yes, they approved. Does anyone else have anything to input on that, Karen or Lisa or Caitlin?
So there are some sample checklists for the early childhood that have been put together. There's some great ones. There's a couple of Facebook pages that if people are Facebook people, I'm not a big social media person, but for people who are, there's Ohio Temporary Pandemic Childcare Providers, which is one of the Facebook groups that you can join. And on that one, there's actually a provider that was a pandemic provider that posted their entire handbook, as well as checklists and forms and things that she was using. And she had a really good checklist for this. the Early Learning Resources Ohio, which is runs through OCRA, which is the Ohio Childcare Resource and Referral, is a great resource where they have lots of forms and policies that are samples that you can change up and utilize for yourself as well. And they have some great samples that are out there that are really helpful as well. So and that's really inexpensive to join. And then also for providers that are OACCP members, OACCP has put out a whole sample kit of things like this to be able to help providers navigate these changes that they need to make to their programs as well.
Are there any online or apps that you know that will do this? Have you heard of?
I have heard of a couple of apps out there that are apps normally that providers were already using for parent communication that have added some of these guidelines and sample forms to their app. It's not particularly one that we use, so I'm not sure what's out there. Caitlin or Lisa may have some better knowledge of those, but I know I've seen a few ads for some of the different programs. But if people already had some of those groups that they were using, I'm sure that they've gotten the same emails I have that have said there's some different tools that you can utilize.
Karen, what is your recommendation on how long to keep the tracking of this when they're doing their checklist?
So I think, that's something that each provider is going to have to kind of monitor and check. I think it's more important to have a good, solid policy and practice that you're doing on a regular basis. I'm a little concerned from the HIPAA violation concerns of people keeping some of this information on site because it needs to be kept very privately.
Right.
And so I would be more concerned about how that's being kept. As long as you've got a good policy and practice in place that you know that everybody that's entering your building has gone through it, I think that is the safest means to go by. I would also encourage people to talk with their insurance company and see what their insurance company recommendations are, because each insurance company might be a little bit different in what they're recommending. But there is not a requirement for this from the state's perspective, like there is for a lot of the other paperwork requirements that we have. There is not a particular requirement for this from the state.
So we had briefly discussed some the waivers.
Waiver.
Yeah.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the waivers to have children or parents signed?
This is nothing that ODJFS and the resource and referral agencies are going to require. So I talked to Karen ahead of time. So as a provider, I thought it'd be best for her to comment on that since we are not requiring it as an agency or the ODJFS.
Okay.
So I would suggest to providers to take a look at your current language that's in your policies handbooks for parents, as well as the forms that you have parents sign. Sometimes the language that you need is already in there because obviously communicable diseases is something that we deal with on a regular basis all the time, whether it's RSV or the flu or chickenpox or other types of communicable diseases. That's just something that in early childhood we have dealt with for years and years. And so we've already got some good practices around that and normally some pretty good policies in our handbooks around that. What I would suggest is that people go back and review what they already have and see if they feel like it's covered. They may want to talk again to their insurance company or to their legal representation to see what they think about whether they feel that the language is covered in there. If not, again, there's some good resources on those same sites that I just gave that give some great waiver information, as well as the Montgomery County Preschool Promise had some legal representation draw up an example. It's not one that they're requiring either, but it was an example that providers could utilize or take a look at to have some language around, a waiver for parents to sign that says you're not responsible if their child would happen to get COVID while attending the program. 8-10 weeks ago, there was a lot of questions around this particular issue because there were so many unknowns about COVID. What there is not is obviously a good, judicial, process that's happened in the past so that we have judicial law around COVID. So all of that's going to be new, and whether you have a waiver or not is not going to necessarily keep somebody from suing you. However, I think it would be very difficult. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it would be very difficult for somebody to actually win a case like that, since obviously there's a prevalence within the community. It would be hard to prove where they actually contacted COVID from. So, but my suggestion would be for people to talk to their insurance company and to talk to their legal representation to see if they felt like they needed to have stronger language than what they might already have in their handbooks or forms that they have parents sign.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so recommended best practices for staff in general is that childcare workers should wear a cloth face covering unless it's unsafe for them to do so. And the cloth face coverings should not be worn if the person has trouble breathing, is unconscious, is incapacitated, and they are unable to remove the mask without assistance. I thought that was kind of unusual that they put that in there. So face covering should be cloth or fabric, and they should cover your nose, mouth, and chin if you're going to use them. And again, staff should stay home if they're sick. So this is from the suggestions from the Department of Job and Family Services is to keep your staff to child ratio as low as you can. If you do use personal protection equipment, change it frequently and whenever it's needed. Gloves should be used for cleaning, preparing food, and diapering, which I believe is already in your guidelines. And staff should avoid communal spaces such as offices and break rooms, so staff shouldn't be congregating and passing it among each other. And they also recommend not eating and drinking with other staff members. Anyone have anything to add there? Okay.
I think the one thing that I would add is that as you will see, as most providers already know, many of the things that are suggestions on here or requirements from the state are part of the 794 regulations that childcare providers already had in their health and safety regulations. And now, we've gotten the rest of the world to realize that, doing an elephant sneeze and sneezing or coughing into your elbow or washing your hands throughout the day, as we already did in early childhood, that those are the best practices that are needed to fight COVID just the same. We already were cleaning surfaces throughout the day and doing many of these things that are already recommended and are required under this. And now we're just doing them on steroids. Additional pieces in here that they're asking or suggesting for people to do. But I think what's really important is to recognize that in the early childhood field, we already had a really solid foundation around some of these mitigation strategies, because health and safety is what we do. It's in our DNA.
I would also say that they're recommending a lot of these, but they're not making them mandatory because they understand that there's so much variation between different childcare providers in your situation, etc. So.
But to Karen's point, these are things that, and this was part of our advocacy to get them to open childcare, these are the things that we already are doing. So if there are childcare programs, the pandemic programs, they have already been doing these, and even the ones that are closed down currently, these are the things that are the natural things for them to do. This is in our wheelhouse. So this is not like there's a lot of different things that need to happen. There is some flexibility with what is put out there, but these are the things that we already do to keep our children safe. So it's a very comfortable place for us to be because it's already what we were doing, which is a great thing.
And I will also say that not just with childcare, but all businesses, sometimes it's the perception of the safety for your clients. So you want to make sure that they understand what you're doing too.
Correct.
Okay, so this is back to a mandatory, and this is at drop-off. All children should wash their hands upon entering the classroom, which already do. That may require that providers assist the children with hand washing. They would like you to check, this is mandatory, to check the temperatures of all staff, children, and adults upon arrival. And any individual with a fever of 100 degrees or higher or higher may not enter the facility. Okay, any comments or?
I have something real quick.
Okay.
So I just want to make sure that everybody knows we're no longer adding a degree. So what the temperature is what it is. They just stopped doing the added degree a while ago. So if it's 100, it's 100. If it's 99, it's 99. So.
Okay, thank you.
And I think that's a great point that Caitlin added, because I think that's a good example of, again, in early childhood, we already had a lot of these practices. So obviously we took temperatures of children whenever they were showing symptoms or didn't feel well. So that's not a new thing for us to do. The new part of it is, for us, is taking the temperatures of all staff and children as they enter, whether they're showing symptoms or not. And obviously that's just to, again, put our practices on steroids and hopefully create a little bit more of a mitigation around the spread of COVID. I think it's important for people to understand that anybody that enters your building, any adult that enters your building, you're going to need to take their temperature. So for example, if you have a delivery that's coming and that individual comes into your building, you're going to need to take their temperature at that time and make sure that they don't have a temperature of over 100 degrees. If a parent enters the building, that would be an adult that would need their temperature taken. In a lot of cases, providers will not be having the parents come into the building. They'll be doing a drop-off outside of the door. However, if they do enter the building, that is one thing that the state is asking, is that any adult that enters also has their temperature taken.
All right, thank you. Okay, so recommended best practices at drop-off are to adjust pickup and drop-off of children to ensure social distancing. And some of those strategies are to stagger your drop-off and pick-up times. The parent or the caretaker should wear a mask for pickup and drop-off if they're able to. The child should be dropped off and picked up by the same person every day. If you can do it, do curbside pickup and drop off. I was misspelling there, sorry. And single employee, one employee should be the one that's operating the pickup and drop off and escorting all children to and from classroom, not a variety of employees doing that. And again, as Karen just said, limit parent and visitor entry into the facility. Okay. And this was from, these are from the Job and Family Services suggestions, is to talk to the child and the parent and staff member about how they've been feeling. And, you know, ask if anybody in their family is sick. So that would give you some insight there. Observe for signs of illness, flushed or rapid or difficulty breathing, fatigue or extreme fussiness. That can be done at the drop-off as well. And during the drop-off, to protect the providers and the staff, you can do physical barriers, social distancing, and wearing the personal protection equipment as well. They actually have a whole segment about different ways you can do that, put up barriers and things like that on the site. So that is helpful as well. Any comments?
So one comment that I just wanted to share, I know a lot of people have purchased the thermometers that are the no-touch thermometers that use an infrared. Just one point of caution with those, as we start to come into warmer weather, especially if a child is traveling in a car that doesn't have air conditioning, that the contact temperature could be warmer for a hot second when the child first gets there, or if they've been standing in the sun for a while. Same thing with your staff. And so if somebody would happen to have a high temperature for a minute, you might ask them to go sit in their car in the air conditioning for 5 minutes, cool down, and once they've cooled down, take their temperature again. Many times their temperature will fluctuate, again, if it's really hot and they've been standing in the hot sun for a period of time with those skin contact thermometers.
Okay. And I did put this in later down in the presentation, but there's also some, there's a Dayton company that sells, it's called Tepogenics, and they sell the paper strips that can be on your head. They're a startup business and they're taken off because of the situation, but that might also be a, they're disposable. They can stay on your forehead for like all day generally. And people can see that. That might be an option too.
There's also some interesting technology that uses a what looks like a tablet, and you stand in front of the tablet and it takes your temperature, and then basically you know, you set it for a temperature setting and it'll either show green if they're fine, or it shows yellow or red if they're within certain temperature zones, so that you don't necessarily have to have a person out there standing to take a temperature. Those are you know, fairly pricey, but there's something that, you know, if you think that you may be, that we may be taking temperatures over a period of time, you know, if you add up the cost of having a staff person standing out there taking the temperatures the entire time, you know, the price kind of balances itself out over a period of time.
Another point, just to kind of think about as you're purchasing those thermometers, especially if you're looking at the infrared thermometers, some of them look almost gun-shaped. So you might have reactions from children, especially because you're pointing something at them, and it can be a scary thing that you're pointing at them. So just keep in mind that you're dealing with young children and reactions might happen just because they don't know what it is or what you're doing.
You know what, Caitlin, that's actually a really great point. And I think as providers are thinking about how do they prepare for returning to business, they might want to think about, can they create some social stories, or can they put together an email or a picture or a video that they can send to their parents to kind of preview with the children what to expect, because it's going to be different when they return to the program. They're not used to necessarily seeing their teachers wearing masks or their parents dropping them at the door versus coming inside. Obviously, they're not used to somebody taking their temperature, and of course are always used to the under the arm versus now with the infrared thermometers. So I know that's something that we created for our parents, and it really helped the parents that had gone through those social stories with the kids before they returned, had a much better experience on the first day than those that hadn't had that preview ahead of time.
Okay, that's great information. Thank you. Drop off and pick up suggestions from the ODJFS. If you use the TAP system, encourage parents to sign in with their own smartphone, so you're not having people touch the same devices. If you use the system with multiple users, disinfect it between use. And if parents physically sign children in and out, write it. You can do it yourself, or you can keep a cup with disinfected pens in one spot and used pens that need to be disinfected in another one. So once it's used, it gets put in the needs to be disinfected. Or you can also request parents to use their own pens as a way to stop spread of germs. They also recommend setting up a hygiene station at the entrance of the program. The preferred way is to wash with soap and water, but hand sanitizer with at least 60% alcohol solution is acceptable. If you do use hand sanitizer, make sure you keep it out of the children's reach, and it's distributed by the staff or the parent or caregiver. Apparently there's been an increase in calls to poison control because of hand sanitizer, so they were really stressing that pretty hard on that. Anyone have anything to add?
Another suggestion I would have about hand sanitizer, as a lot of people are looking to have their health check stations maybe outside, make sure you're not keeping that hand sanitizer sitting in the direct sunlight. As we're getting into the warmer weather, remember that's 60% or more alcohol content, and therefore it is considered a hazardous substance and is flammable. And so you need to be really careful about having it in the heat or direct sunlight.
Okay, very good. All right, I'm not going to go over these because I know that these are all is all information that it's already in your regulations, but they have the hand washing procedures are in the mandatory section for both staff And for children, it's a little different for each one, but I'm sure everyone is already familiar with all of those. They do have some hand washing videos, though, on the Ohio Job and Family Services. One is geared at young children, that's Sesame Street, and the second one is for a little older children. They say it's for adults, but as I watched it, I thought it's actually pretty much for for kids still. But that's another way to keep kids understanding what is expected of them.
Kim, if you can go back to those two slides real quick.
Okay.
So yes, both of those forms, or both of those informations are found under the Ohio rule, but they're actually found in the Appendix B. So if you're looking for them to print off for your families, it's actually Appendix B that you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. It is actually in the guidelines too for the, I should have shown that right away. The Ohio guidelines. Let me show you what that looks like. Maybe not. Okay. So these are what I'm going over is all written in here, and they do talk about right here all the hand washing. This might be something that would be good to give your parents as well, so they know what's expected by the state of you. But that is the actual guidelines that the state issued in addition to the OAC rules. So, okay. So this was under the mandatory. The child care providers may use non-permanent sinks to meet hand washing requirements. I'm not sure why it's mandatory if the word is may, but it's allowed. So
I think the point on that one is we've never been allowed to use non-permanent sinks before for hand washing. And since we do so much hand washing in early childhood in the first place, it's something that we just always, especially with younger children's infants and toddlers where you're toilet training, need to have a sink that's available versus sometimes for the older children, there's the ability to use hand sanitizer in place of a sink, at least in our past regulations. So I think what they're trying to get to is that this is a change, and that's why it's under the mandatory, is just making sure people understand that this is now allowable. It was never allowable before under our previous guidelines and regulations. Also, if people are looking to purchase the non-permanent sinks, the Ohio Association of Child Care Providers has worked with Ozark, who is the largest provider or manufacturer of the non-permanent sinks for early childhood programs, and has a very aggressive discount for members. And for many members, it will pay for your annual dues for OACCP. So I would encourage people, if they are considering purchasing those, to take a look at the discount provided by OACCP.
Great.
That's great to know. Also, our newsletter today did, on our website, we've got a list of vendors, and it's not with the discount that you need to go there for the discount and become a member. But if you're looking for cleaning supplies, masks, the portable sinks, the hand sanitizer, our newsletter that was just sent out this morning just was a reminder that we do have all of those listed. We're not promoting any of them. It's just a resource for you to know that to help guide you in the direction. And then you do your research as to what fits your business needs the best. But that's definitely, it would behoove you to go Karen's direction with, because it would pay for your membership through your discount. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so also mandatory during the day. Child care providers must immediately send home any child or employee who has a temperature of 100 degrees or higher. And before they can come back, and this is nothing new, they have to be fever-free for 24 hours without taking any Tylenol or ibuprofen. And if someone has had contact with someone confirmed or probable to have COVID-19, they must complete isolation or quarantine procedures in coordination with the local health department before that they can return to the program. So that is an addition. Okay. The recommended best practices are that child care providers should cancel all field trips and large group events. And if you don't cancel those, still you need to plan for social distancing and to sanitize all the modes of transportation, etc., before and after you use them. You should try to prevent groups from mixing. So if you have children of the same employer or the same family, if it's feasible based on their ages to have them in the same group. And teachers should remain with their own group. They're asking that support staff, or recommending that support staff should only serve one group of children and not float from room to room. And I know it's, for the larger centers, it's common practice to have a floater that kind of breaks the main teacher. So do any of you have recommendations? I was thinking about wearing that PPE as you float and things like that. Do you, Lisa or Karen or Caitlin?
Yeah, this is one of the areas actually that is a more difficult challenge for programs, mainly because, you know, people still need to go to the bathroom. Mm-hmm. We'll need to take a break here and there. Sometimes we need to tap out for a second just to you know, take a breather. But there are some ways to do this safely. And, you know, one of those is to just think about the social distance between you and the children. If, for example, if somebody needs to step in for a second to let somebody have a bathroom break, instead of being up and in a child's face, you know, are the children on the other side of the room still within sight and sound, but you're within the doorway and keeping an eye on the kids to make sure they're safe until their main teacher comes back to the classroom. And that way you're not really within kind of that sphere of contact with them, but they are within sight and sound for safety purposes. So that's one way that you can think about how can you, you know, deal with the realities of the day and still meet the requirements or the expectations, guidelines that they're expecting. So it's also a challenge sometimes just thinking of, and it's not just the larger programs, but even the smaller programs sometimes have a bigger challenge with this, where you might have a part-time person who works in one classroom in the morning and a different classroom in the afternoon, or they might work a split shift and help to cover two different classrooms. The point of this is to try and minimize any cross contamination between classrooms as much as possible. I know one of the things that we've been looking at is trying to keep family groups together as much as possible. And when we can't, to try and keep that same, if there's a teacher that has to support two different groups, if they're supporting the groups that have siblings in the other group, that's helpful as well. It's not going to be perfect. And I think people just need to take a breath and recognize it's not going to be perfect, but do the best we can. Again, this is a recommended best practice, but there's also the realities of the day of making sure that we are first and foremost following our developmentally appropriate practices to make sure that children and all of the best practices that we've had in early childhood for 30 and 40 years and have built, that we haven't thrown those out the windows, that we think about those first, and then think about how can we do that within this new environment as well.
Very good. Also,
it's been referenced a few times, the PPEs, and I just want to make sure we know that it is not required that the childcare providers and the teachers are wearing PPEs. It is recommended that they're wearing masks, but it is not required that they are PPEs. And it is only recommended that it's wearing masks. So I just want to make sure if they are wearing masks that the cloth or the disposables are also acceptable.
So Caitlin, this is one area that I didn't really cover at all, was the infants and toddlers. Feeding a child and bottle feeding or whatever. Is it, would it be advisable to have some kind of gown, especially if you move from child to child?
I mean, best practice, I would suggest having some changes in aprons or clothing or something like that. We all know that that's not always feasible, especially when you're working in an infant and toddler classroom, to be able to take off and change as you're going through it. But if there's some sort of a barrier you could put up as you're feeding that child, whether it might be a burp cloth that can be washed, whether it's an apron that you can change throughout the day, it might help with reducing the amount of spread of germs, as well as thinking about using gloves while you're feeding an infant a bottle versus just having nothing on your hands, but remembering to take off those gloves too between feeding or diapering, so we're not spreading any germs that way too. So.
Right.
And I would say that most importantly is the hand washing, because I feel like sometimes people look at the idea of wearing gloves and they forget that, you know, wearing gloves is no different than just having your hands. If you're still touching your face, if you're still touching other things and then touching the food products, the most important and what is going to reduce the spread of any germs is good hand washing practices. So hand washing, hand washing, hand washing. If you're washing your hands right before you're feeding the baby, if you're washing hands again before you're touching another baby or touching your face, etc., that will probably, I would expect, do more than anything else.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so another recommended best practice during the day is staggering the use of communal space like playgrounds, lunchrooms, and bathrooms. Definitely sanitizing communal spaces between each group. That's a recommended best practice. Sanitizing toys after each use and remove toys that cannot be sanitized. And again, wearing gloves while serving food and preparing bottles. Again, changing those gloves is very important as well. Any comments on that?
So for the most part, I mean, we've been doing lunchrooms and bathrooms, cleaning and sanitizing them after use. At least that's the best practice to be doing. If you haven't been doing that, I recommend highly that we be doing that. Playgrounds is a new one. We don't always sanitize after use, so that might take a little bit of time to get used to for your staff, especially if you're thinking about working through cleaning and sanitizing some of the outdoor equipment after use and before use.
Okay.
Well,
I believe
I'd like to point out on the outdoor equipment is the CDC just came out with some new guidelines and recommendations around actually not spraying sanitizer on your outdoor equipment because one, it can be corrosive, and two, it can be harmful to the environment. Some other ideas is maybe, you know, marking off different portions of your playground space and rotating that between groups, you know, maybe on a weekly basis or something. And that way it's got the weekend to, that you could wipe it down over the weekend and any germs would be gone then by Monday. So that might be a better way versus going out between each group and spraying it down with chemicals, etc. But I would encourage people to look at the CDC guidelines around, they have some specific guidelines around your outdoor play space and what you should be doing with that.
Okay, thank you. Also during the day, if you're using temporary dividers, they recommend that you use different entrance and exits for each group, that you use separate sinks for each group, and you use different bathrooms for each group. I think that's also very problematic because of space limitations, but that is a best practice. Anyone have any insight on implementation of that or no? Okay.
So I can share a little bit on the barriers that I just would, just from my own experience, we have installed many, many barriers over the last 4 days in our programs. And, you know, normally we spend a lot of time thinking about the layout of our classrooms and, you know, what is developmentally appropriate practices for children to make sure that the play space is laid out appropriately. And most importantly is making sure, again, we don't want to throw out all of our developmentally appropriate practices that we've had over the years, meaning having clear sights of vision throughout the entire classroom, being able to see exit doors and being able to see into the bathrooms, et cetera, so that your children are safe, that there's no blind spots where the children can get behind and you can't see them. And so you really need to spend some time thinking about that if you're going to put up a barrier in your classroom in order to split the groups. And so it's as much of an art as it is a science in how to do that. And making sure that whatever you're using to divide the space is sturdy and is not going to be a fall hazard. I would hate to see a child be hurt because something tipped over, obviously. So I think you need to be careful about that as well. The use of separate sinks and different bathrooms for each group, obviously that's problematic in many of our spaces. However, if you can minimize the groups that are using particular bathrooms or sinks, that's helpful. This is obviously why they allowed the use of the temporary sinks, but also just thinking about if you can, instead of having, 4 or 5 groups share a bathroom, can you have just 2 groups share that bathroom? Sometimes there might be, in early childhood, a lot of times, especially for our younger kids, we'll have 2 toilets in the same room. Is there a way that you can assign one toilet to one group and the other toilet to another group? That can be helpful as well, so that it just cuts down on the amount of contact between the kids and spaces. And again, a practice that we've always had in early childhood is cleaning and sanitizing throughout the day. And so we've always kept, sanitizer in our classrooms up where children can't reach it to be able to clean surfaces throughout the day. It's just going to be something that we're going to have to get in more of a practice of going in and spraying down the surfaces in the bathroom on a more regular basis. We were already doing that a lot throughout the day, but even doing it more every time a child comes out of the bathroom, I think that's just going to be more important for us to do.
Just to piggyback on what Karen was saying, if you're thinking about using dividers that are see-through, I've had some programs in the past, especially with spacing in the napping area with cribs in an infant classroom with plexiglass. So I've had people install plexiglass, which is absolutely fine as long as it's within regulation. But do consider on whatever barrier you're using that you're checking to make sure that there's no sharp edges as well, because plexiglass can come in very sharp edges and can hurt the children. If their hands are going to be on it all day anyway, just make sure that you're going to go through and do that safety check on them as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, Terry put in the chat box that they're taking tot containers for each classroom to play outside also.
Mm-hmm.
So,
that's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the suggestions from the ODJFS are toys and materials, and this goes to what Terry just said, was to have individual sets of supplies rather than shared supplies. You need to think about if you're going to allow items from home, and if you can disinfect them when they're brought in, that'll be important. Any shared toys that you are using should be easily cleaned, and remove toys that are likely to be held close to a child's face, like play glasses or phones. Anything that children will put by their face automatically would be. But they did also say that anything, they're going to use their imagination to put it as a phone. So, and have a designated germ bin for toys that need to be sanitized. So those were some of their suggestions. They also talked about dramatic play and consider about how the dress-up clothes, the puppets, and the fabric toys can be cleaned. So as you're planning it out, would those be some things you might not include if you couldn't easily clean them? And they also suggest that maybe, and you had said this with the play areas as well, rotate toys from multiple categories to offer each day so that others can be sanitized, but you still have some available. So it's not like everything's out at once, but you kind of rotate them so you have a schedule for cleaning kind of thing.
I think an important point is to recognize that you're going from a classroom that may have 24 preschoolers in it to one that has 9.
Yeah.
So you don't need as much out as what you might have needed out before. And so it's a great opportunity to pull a lot of those equipment pieces out of service for the moment and to rotate them back in as children, play with them and touch them, and then be able to, for example, if somebody plays with a set of blocks, that set of blocks can go away and another set can come out. And it allows then either some natural disinfection over time or the ability for you to clean and disinfect those toys in between the use. And so I think this is a good opportunity for us to do that. That was always a best practice in early childhood, was to rotate your toys or to have a germ bin, but it's just that much more important now to have those practices be something that we're really paying close attention to.
Right.
I also think to consider those infants and toddlers and preschoolers even that bring their little loveys in, their safety and security items that we're just be conscious of if they're disinfected, or do you wash them as soon as they arrive, those sort of things. So just keep those things in mind as you're reopening, along with those suggestions.
One of the videos for the OJDFS or they had was that suggested putting like a picture of mom or dad in the cubby or somewhere they can, as a replacement for maybe those loveys, that they can always see a picture of mom or dad. And
the other thing to think about is to give each child like a giant size Ziploc bag.
Mm-hmm.
You can put those items in instead of just having them out and loose. And that way, if they need them at nap time during their own private time, when they're in their private space, they can have it, and then it goes back into the Ziploc bag afterwards, so that you're not having the cross-contamination, et cetera. So I think there's ways for us, because you also don't want to take away, again, this is where those developmentally appropriate practices come in. You don't want to be putting extra stress on the child by taking away whatever their security item is. And so we need to think about, are there ways to do that in a safe manner, versus just, saying, no, you can't have your lovey or whatever it is that makes them feel like home.
Yeah.
And it will always be better if we communicate what our process is to parents ahead of time, so the parent can talk with the child about it. So it's not coming as a shock that the teacher is putting this process in place. So thinking ahead of how we're going to handle those things, and then communicating that out to parents so they know, number one, it's going to be safe. And number two, this is how we're still going to take care of your child, but we're doing it to keep everybody around you safe.
Right. Now, Jamaica just put in the chat box that they were tossing around the idea of steaming items with a handheld steamer to disinfect them when they came in if needed.
Interesting idea. I hadn't heard that from anybody.
Yeah.
That's an interesting concept.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't either.
Okay. So other suggestions are definitely talk to the children, make sure, and you're automatically going to do this, but teach them about the safe toy play, about putting it in their mouth or not putting them by their face. That's harder to do with them being younger, but the older kids, you definitely talk to them so they understand. And
this is where the smaller ratio right now, since we are in that smaller ratio, it is going to be beneficial because you're going to have a smaller number of children to the provider. So it's going to be a little bit easier to monitor than if we had our larger ratio, because there's a lot to be watching for right now.
Yeah. Okay, so with outdoor play, they the CDC encourages increasing outdoor time if possible, and keeping the groups separate, staggering times, and try to set schedules that prevent different groups from crossing paths if you're a larger provider. Also evaluate some traditional activities, things like not blowing bubbles, but using a wand rather than blowing, and creating a sanitation backpack that you can sanitize some things after each group if you want, or if you need to. For napping and sleeping, they said that try to place your cots and cribs 6 feet apart with children facing head to toe. Consider using plastic dividers between cots and cribs. And if children usually nap in large common spaces, consider napping in rooms or staggering the nap times. Any input on that?
This is another one that I think is a challenging one for a lot of providers, just because we're limited on space, right?
Yeah.
Space is at a premium. So trying to place cots or cribs 6 feet apart is incredibly challenging. I guess the encouragement that I would give to providers is think about your classroom setup, and is there a way to set them as far apart as possible? You might not be able to get to the 6 feet, but maybe you can get it further than 2 feet. That is what's required under our current regulations. So I would encourage people to just think about that. I know one of the things that we did, because obviously if you're going from having 10 or 12 babies in a classroom now to only having 4 or 6, it means that you won't be using maybe half of your cribs that are in the classroom. So what you may be able to do in order to save a little bit of space is put your cribs end to end, but then place your children every other crib instead of putting them in cribs that are next to each other, since you'll only be using half of your cribs right now anyway. And that may give you a little bit more space to be able to have the children a little bit further apart. To think about, especially with babies, that a lot of times they nap on their own schedule. So is there a way for you to think about where you're placing the cribs depending on the children's nap time schedules, so that the ones that are napping at the same time maybe aren't in that space at the same time, they're at opposite ends or something. So that's another just way that you can kind of think about that a little bit. Now with our older kids, our toddlers and preschoolers, it's a little bit harder to do that since they all nap more at the same time. But definitely putting them head to toe obviously extends the amount of space between their faces. And, you know, thinking about how far apart we can get them. And in the meantime, again, not forgetting our current practices of what is best practices as far as keeping everybody within sight and sound. So you don't want to put them in a space where you may not be able to see them.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to the pickup, and this is mandatory. A lot of this is same as the drop-off. Make sure that the children wash their hands prior to departure. Again, that may require that providers must help them with hand washing. So best practices, recommended best practices at pickup are to modify pickup to ensure social distancing. Again, staggering drop-off and pickup. Caregivers should wear a mask if it's safe to do so, and to conduct curbside pickup and drop-off. Again, with a single employee operating the pickup and drop-off if possible. Okay. And then we're moving to the physical environment, and these are the mandatory requirements. Child care providers can use temporary walls to divide a room into smaller spaces, but smaller space must still contain 35 square feet per child, and the divider must be at least 6 feet in height. It must be easily sanitized, so you don't want anything porous that you can't clean. And make sure that any way you're dividing the room up still meets fire safety requirements that are set by local authorities. And those are mandatory. And this is from the ODJFS. They suggest that you reassess your room configuration to increase space between children and staff. Possibly have all tables facing in the same direction rather than facing each other. Putting fewer children at a table. Possibly assigning each child their own chair rather than sharing chairs. Eliminate clutter so it's easier to clean. Opening windows for fresh air if possible. Possibly rolling up carpets or covering those with mats that are easily cleaned. And have individual bins for sensory play or rather than shared items. Any comments or suggestions? Okay. So with the confirmed cases, it's mandatory that you immediately isolate and seek medical care for any individual that develops symptoms while at the facility. And that's children and staff. Shut down the rooms for deep sanitation if possible, and to immediately identify or notify ODJFS in writing of any confirmed cases of COVID-19 among either children or staff. Recommended best practices are to work with the local health department to identify potentially infected or exposed individuals in order to help facilitate the contact tracing and notification. And once testing is available, to test all suspected infections or exposures, and following testing, contact the health department to initiate appropriate care and tracing. Any comments on that? Okay. That is HIP is overridden when you have to contact the health department. So that was something that crossed my mind was.
I think the one thing that's important to recognize is, we've had about 25,000 children that have been attending temporary pandemic childcare programs throughout these last 8 or 9 weeks. And with that, there's been very minimal experiences of COVID that have happened within programs. And those have happened mainly with the adults, with the teacher in the program. And we've been very lucky that we have not seen those become hotspots, like we've seen, for example, in nursing homes or in the prisons where it has spread to the population around them. So I think that goes to say a lot about the practices and procedures that childcare providers already have in place to mitigate the spread of any germs within our environment, is that we haven't seen that. Now, I totally expect, and I don't think anybody should be under the idea that we're not going to have COVID in childcare centers, because as long as it's in the environment, it is going to happen. And so I think it's important that providers be prepared that they may have either a staff person or a child that tests positive or gets exposed to COVID, and that they may then have to contact JFS and the health department and follow their guidelines. I've heard from a lot of providers that says, well, what does that mean? And there is no direct, they're going to close your center down for a matter of days or just that classroom or not, because it's all going to depend on what's happening in the environment around you. So are they having a hotspot in your community at that time? Or it's going to depend on who all has that teacher or child come into contact with. But in many cases, it may just be that they shut down a particular classroom versus the entire center, and that they just for a period of time have that classroom and those children that might have been exposed quarantined for say 14 days before opening that classroom up, but not disrupting the rest of the building. So I think, again, that's part of the reason we're trying to keep the teachers limited to just one group of children versus having exposure to a lot of groups of children, so that if that teacher happens to be the one that tests positive, they don't end up having 3 classrooms, say, that have now had exposure in that case.
And I think it's a little different for family childcare because you don't have the separate classrooms. You're one entity, you're one program. So if you have some serious concerns about what would be the next steps around closure, if a case was opened, I strongly encourage you to reach out to your JFS specialist, especially the help desk. I know sometimes is not always as helpful as we want them to be, but your specialist is definitely getting firsthand information and is usually pretty good about getting back to you on what those next steps might look like for you should a positive case appear. Terry sent a quick question in the chat. So Terry, just for the carpet, rolling up the carpet is more around rugs or mats that are in your classroom, or in your program, just trying to reduce the amount of spread there. And if it's a carpet that's wall to wall, they're asking as a best practice to put some sort of a mat down that can be sanitized or cleaned up afterwards. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so some other best practices from ODJFS is to definitely make a plan ahead of time. Plan your space, your staffing needs. You should update your communicable disease plan, update your parent handbook. Something I hadn't thought about, but if you've been shut down, you might need to do something with your water supply, either running water to get all the bacteria that's settled out, so letting it run for a while. I did include a handout there in the handouts package from the EPA that talks about this issue, so you can go back and look at that. Also, as part of your plan, think about the additional supplies that you're going to need for cleaning or for masks or whatever it is. Thermometers, again, I put that's the link to the Tempogenics with the paper thermometers. So also best practice would be to make sure that you're communicating well. Communication is going to be vital, not just between parents and caretakers, but between you and your staff as well. So Also, so request your parents and the caretakers update emergency information. You should review and test those contacts, make sure they work, and definitely create some, or strengthen, because I know you already have created, but strengthen the strategies for sharing information with staff and parents. And intensifying cleaning and disinfecting. So the recommendation is to clean and sanitize all areas nightly. Clean and sanitize areas used by more than one group between each group's use. And there's some areas that you want to clean even more frequently, like doorknobs, light switches, classroom sink handles, and countertops. I don't think that's anything new, but you're probably going to step it up a lot. And so the EPA has a list of registered household disinfectants that can be used. I have the link here. So if you're not sure if something is appropriate, there's a list. You can go and check it and see if it meets their requirements. They also recommend using EPA registered disposal wipes to wipe down keyboards, desks, and remote controls. And again, you're already doing this, but store your disinfectants and cleaning agents safely. So anyone else? I think that was the last slide on that.
I would just add to it, as you're looking through that list, if you're looking for a specific disinfectant, that you're following the procedure that's on the back of how to disinfect. Some of them require you to rinse off those disinfectants. Others say wait 10 minutes between wiping it down. So just making sure you're following what the procedures are for what's listed on the back of the actual product.
And I did include a PDF of an EPA steps, disinfectant steps. There's 6 steps. So that's included in the handout. So if you want to look at that as well, but definitely look at their website and the directions.
I would also encourage people, I know right now that there's a lot of us that might get a little overly active in our cleaning regimen, and just be really careful of not mixing agents and using one particular chemical and then a different chemical. Obviously that can have really negative reactions, so be really careful about that as well.
Thank you.
And remember to clean first, then sanitize.
Yes.
Right. Thank you. Okay, so I also wanted to address your business itself, not just the safety precautions for your staff and your children, but recommendations for your business. And Karen already mentioned talking to your insurance company to see if they have any requirements for coverage. We talked about keeping logs or records of health for both children and staff. You'll need to think that through, and there's some we already talked about this too, infectious disease waivers. So those are some things that I thought we needed to cover as well. Anything to add to those? We've already talked about those. I'm not sure if there's any. Okay.
Did we discuss when I was having my audio issues that they need to go into OCLQS to let them know that they are going to be open and what date they're going to open?
No, we did not.
Yeah, that's an important piece. It is not just automatically assumed that you're going to open up. So they need to go in there and mark down the date that they're going to, because some programs are choosing to delay their start date. So it's very important that they go in there and mark the date that they're going to open up.
Okay.
And do that by June 7th.
Thank you. Thank you. Yep, there's this end date to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so also for your business, you're going to need to keep on top of your cash flow. Your profitability is going to be reduced because of the ratios being smaller. You're probably going to need some extra staff as well with the cleaning and the intake and all sorts of things. So you need to figure that out. Make sure that you're on top of it, that you have projected that it's doable. Because if you can't, you don't want to get in the hole with this. If this isn't something that you can at least break even, if not profit, you might want to consider waiting until some of these requirements are.
So
Yes.
there was a question in the chat box that with all the new requirements, are you hearing childcare centers increasing fees due to the reduced capacity? So Karen, go ahead and start with it. And I'll just add if there's anything else once you're done. It's a great question.
Providers that are doing that either on just increasing their fees as a flat rate or creating kind of a COVID fee that's an additional fee that's on top of their regular weekly or monthly tuition rate. I was going to say it was, I laughed a little bit when you used the word profitability. In this, we don't see a lot of that, whether you're for profit or not for profit. It doesn't really matter. The margins are incredibly slim. So I know a lot of providers, whenever we see this recommendation around conserve cash, we all kind of chuckle a little bit because that's not an option for many of us. This is an industry that already was in dire straits from the standpoint of it just is incredibly financially slim margins. And so obviously the last 2 months have put an incredible hit financially on early childhood providers, and these reduced capacities that the state has put in place makes it so that it is impossible to operate at a break-even margin. And so in many cases I would really encourage people to think about, is it worth in dividing a classroom to bring in another group of 6 or another group of 9 children? Because in many times that will just cause you to lose more money. So you're already going to lose money with the first group of 6. If you put another group of 6 and divide that classroom, are you just going to lose more? So you really have to think about, how much cash do I have on hand? How long can I operate at a loss? Is there grants or loans that I can get that will help, make that time frame a little bit longer, and I can look at it as a loss leader in order to hold on to my families for a little bit? But I would really encourage people to not just jump into, flash and reopen their doors, but to first look at the finances and let that lead your decision, and not necessarily your heart. We have so many good people in the early childhood field that look at their families first and say, but they need this. What's going to happen to these children if I'm not there for them? And those are real issues and real concerning, but what's going to happen to them long term if you open your doors and can only last for a month or 2 and then shut your doors permanently? So I really encourage people to spend the time to really look at your finances before just reopening the door.
Yeah.
And if you've heard of the CARES Act, there is $60 million, which feels like a large amount of money. It is supposed to go to private pay and to PFCC, but it has not been decided how that's going to be distributed. And bottom line, it probably is not even going to take us through the summer. So that is not, you cannot rely on that is going to sustain you if the ratios remain the same. And if you've been following the governor's updates, it does not look like this is something that is just going to end June 30th, right? So, we don't have that crystal ball to know when some of these ratios might change, but just to Karen's point of looking ahead of how long can you sustain this, is as amazing as it is with this heart that you have to look at what can you financially sustain with this. And there are the different loans and things out there. And we don't know exactly where the CARES Act is going to go. There's a lot of moving parts right now, but you've got to figure out what is going to work for you and your families. Can your families sustain a little bit of an increase? Can you handle a little bit? And there's not one equation that's going to work for everybody.
So, I haven't heard anything about this, and I wondered if you did. So kids that are Title 20, are they allowing any extra money or not?
Unfortunately, at this time, once we reopen childcare, we will go back to our payment structure as it was pre-COVID, which means that you're being paid on attendance and not enrollment. And that the rates go back. During the pandemic time, they were paying at the highest payment level, the 5-star level. It will go back to whatever star rating or unrated payment that we had pre-COVID, depending on your star level. And so again, for a lot of providers, that financially is going to be very unstable. And there is not a plan at the moment for them to increase that. In fact, I would encourage people to be prepared that long-term there could be a decrease in that, because obviously our state budget is going to take an enormous hit because our tax revenues are down. And so they're going to have to find ways to be, to cut funds within our state budget. And the state early childhood budget, about 50% of that comes from the Child Development Block Grant, which is our federal block grant. About, give or take, around 25% of it is TANF dollars, which is Temporary Assistance of Needy Families, which is also federal dollars that are block granted to the state that can be used for a lot of different programs. And a lot of those programs are ones that people really need right now. And so it's not a matter of, do people, is childcare more important than housing or food or whatever? They're all really important. So those TANF dollars are really going to be something that are very coveted. And it wouldn't surprise me if childcare loses a great portion of those TANF dollars over the next, say, 6 to 18 months as we look at budget corrections bills and the next state budget. So, and then we have about 25% of our funds that are general revenue funds. And again, our general revenue comes from our tax dollars, and which we know those tax dollars are going to be down because people weren't spending the last 8 weeks in the way that we have been in the past. And so they're going to have to make adjustments to the budget. Now, much of that general revenue funds are match for the federal funds that we get. So they have to keep a certain amount of match in there in order to pull down the maximum amount from the federal government. But that we do get more than what the current match is. So there could be cuts within that area too. So all of that to say, there's the potential that we see our overall childcare budget get reduced over the next, however, from now till the next 18 months while we're in this economic down cycle. And so I would be prepared as a provider. I know I'm preparing myself for rates may actually get cut, not get increased during this time frame, even while we're serving less children.
Okay, thank you. So I also
great
wanted
news.
Sorry to be good. I just very realistic.
Well, I got to tell you that my hope is that someone's going to realize that nobody's going to be able to come back to work without having kids being taken care of.
The reality is there is no economic recovery for us without childcare. There about 67% of people in the workforce, or I should say children, have either one or both of their parents, like if they're in a single household or both parents in the household, all of them are working. 67% of our kids. So where will those children go if we don't have childcare? And I think it's really important for us to realize that just with this reduction, going down to either a max of 6 children or 9 children in our classrooms, we're going to lose about 173,000 licensed childcare slots in our state, just from that alone. That's enormous. We're only going to be able to serve about 112,000 children in childcare when we're done. And so where will those children go? And do they have the 794 health and safety regulations that we already have in place to keep these children safe? And, so are parents either making a choice to give up their job? Are they making the choice to put their child in unlicensed and unregulated care? And I'm not saying that that's unsafe, but in many cases it can be, and there's not the oversight that you have in licensed care. Or, are they making other choices and you have children that are staying home alone or those sort of things? It really is concerning to think about. And I know in our programs, we're full on June 1st with our new capacities and turning families away that have been our long-term families and they don't know what they're going to do for childcare because we don't have the capacity to serve everybody. And
so Karen,
yes.
Can I ask you that in case that there's a provider that might have this question? Yes. How did you make your decisions as you had to prioritize at your desk since you have multiple programs?
So we had 2 different structures set up for how we made decisions around what we were going to do upon reopening. So some of our programs are private pay only, so they don't accept publicly funded childcare. And in those programs, we had asked parents to pay 50% in order to hold their spot during the closure. And so those parents obviously got priority as we reopened. And we reopened those programs under a pandemic license last week. Knock on wood, the opening went great. And we had a huge number of our families come back immediately, which was fantastic, and a large portion more that are coming back June 1st. In our programs that take publicly funded, obviously they don't have the ability to hold their slot by paying for something to do that. And so we had to make different decisions. And we also have Head Start and Early Head Start in those programs. So we prioritize those children to come back first. And then we basically did a first come, first serve basis. So if people didn't need care because they haven't been called back to their job until July or later, unfortunately, we're not going to have space for their children. Like I said, we are full in those buildings June 1st when we open the doors.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Those are tough decisions.
They were very difficult decisions. I will, just from an advocacy perspective, I would encourage people, we're trying to collect the stories of those families that aren't going to have access to childcare. And I should say access to licensed childcare, which again, the importance of licensed childcare over unlicensed, unregulated care. I think we'll see even a bigger portion of that come August when kids go back to school or go back to college that won't have access. They might be using a high school student or a college student right now to kind of get them through the summer. But we're encouraging those families that have been shut out of childcare to go onto social media and use hashtag #ShutOutOfChildcare to be able to share their story around the fact that in order to go back to work, they need licensed, safe childcare. And so I'll put that hashtag in the chat box along with the hashtag that Ohio Childcare is safe, which is another hashtag that we're using on social media to try and help spread the word that we already, again, have 794 health and safety regulations in childcare. We already, had the experience over the last 8 weeks of serving 25,000 kids across Ohio. And so we have the data that shows that we've had very minimal exposure with COVID because of the mitigation strategies that are already in place in early childhood.
Yes, thank you very much. So I also wanted to let you know about assistance that's available through the SBDC. That's who I work for. I'm not sure if everyone is aware of what the SBDC is, but we are funded by the federal government and the state government, and some by the city of Dayton as well. And so we provide business advice at no cost, trainings at no cost, and one-on-one counseling sessions. Mark Langford, one of our counselors, is doing a Managing Post-COVID-19 Expenses and Liabilities webinar on Friday, which I would recommend if you're looking at your cash flow, etc. You might get some good pointers from that if you attend that. And you can register for counseling and for workshops right on our website, which the URL is right there. I also didn't want to end this without talking about the PPP. It is available still for small businesses. Sometimes it's hard to find the bank that's still providing it, but there are ECDI is out of Columbus and Cincinnati. I know they are still doing it. QuickBooks, PayPal have been doing it, as well as some of the smaller community banks. And those PPP loans, if you haven't gotten one yet, they have forgiveness for up to 8 weeks of payroll, which could certainly help you initially. Won't help past August or whatever, but and the interest rate, if you don't get full forgiveness, is very reasonable. It's only 1%, and it is a loan for 2 years, and there's a deferred 6-month payment on that. I also wanted to mention that Montgomery County has money through the CARES Act that they're putting together a grant for small businesses that have not been able to get some of the loans through the SBA. And it is not up yet. They're still working out the details, but I would keep an eye out on that for the Montgomery County CARES Act loans. Because that might be also, or they're not loans, they're grants. They said between 5,000 and 10,000 is what they think, but they're still navigating that. And that was it for me. Did anyone else have anything to add, or any questions as well?
So a couple of things that I wanted to add is just to, and you had mentioned it in the beginning, but I just want to mention it again, is the best practices video that was put out by ODJFS. It came out, I think, on Friday.
Yeah.
It has some great information. I would encourage people to watch that. Also, there will be some new rules that come out. We're anxiously awaiting for those every day. And so there's 5 new rule packages that'll come out as emergency rules. A couple of those are our operational regulations. So for centers, for homes, for in-home aides, and I feel like I'm missing somebody on that. And then there'll also be a package on our Chapter 16 rules, which are our publicly funded childcare regulations. So keep your eye out for those, and those will be more of the mandates of what's required, but it'll also help to give us an idea of what won't they be focusing on over the next couple of months. Obviously, there's some challenges with things like, we've got some time limited requirements of children have to have their physicals every year, and you have to have your fire inspection every year and your health inspection every year. Well, because we've been closed for the last 8 weeks, and so have a lot of those places, there's been people who their food service license, for example, may have expired during the last 8 weeks, and they're giving a little bit of time or extending those. But the details of that will come out in the new regulations, the emergency rules, whenever those are published. I would suspect that those will be published sometime between now and the 1st, hopefully sooner rather than later, so that we have a chance to look at those. And then also the information that Lisa had mentioned on the CARES Act grant. We are expecting that information anytime as well. And that will be a reopening grant. As Lisa said, I would suspect that there is not going to be more than a month to 2 months worth of funds that come from that. So I would encourage people, as they're really doing their financial analysis of, can I last through this long term, to think about what does it look like after those dollars go away, and don't expect those dollars to make you whole. They will minimize the loss. They will not necessarily make you whole.
And Tosin works for Montgomery County, and in the chat box, she just put a link so that you can sign up for email alerts for the Montgomery County grant. That's not the Ohio grant, it's the Montgomery County grant. So thank you, Tosin.
We at 4C are continuing to do virtual trainings throughout these months. So we're sending out, there's webinars that are being made available to providers, as well as actual trainings, for credit, and some for credit and some for not as you're restarting. Those around hand washing and disinfecting, food safety, mental health, working with families, those types of topics, as well as Ohio approved topics, all virtual right now. So if your staff need any of those, reach out to us. Excuse me, I can't talk today. Reach out to us and we'll get you signed up for those classes.
Okay. Anything else from anyone?
I don't think so.
Okay, well, I got to tell you, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen and Lisa and Caitlin. You exceeded my expectations. You did a great job, and I know that everyone learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Sure.
Happy to help. Good luck, everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.